special guests.
And when we say special, we mean fantastic. We don't mean it.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah. Now, I sent you an email earlier today about what did you want to talk about. But I'll tell you what I want to talk about.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see that because all of your emails go into my junk folder automatically. So that's the reason I didn't reply.
I know. I understand. Right. I was thinking, so I wanted to... Rachel Maddow recently overtook Sean Hannity as the #1 cable news show. And we did a video on it, and basically we just repeated an Onion article because the Onion articles now are actual articles about her. So my theory was that you have to overtake. So Sean Hannity was the #1 newsman because he hammers a partisan view regardless of facts, right? And he'll go into conspiracy theories and whatever, and all about Barack Obama being a socialist, Benghazi, the whole thing was nonstop. And so he was the #1. And now Rachel Maddow, my assessment is doing the exact mirror opposite of that on the left, where everything goes back to Russia and everything's a conspiracy with Russia, and it's all about that. And so she's done it and, decoupled from facts, and that has been so partisan. It's been so successful for them. Now she's the #1. Why would they ever stop doing this? Now, what do you think of that assessment?
So I think it's important to realize the origins of hyper-partisan cable news in the U.S. and what drove it and what made it successful, which is basically the Clinton era, when the American right went completely insane, even though they had a president who was this very centrist, neoliberal, figure that they decided was this kind of communist who was married to this lesbian who was murdering her lovers like Vince Foster. They went insane. And of course, they impeached him over a sex scandal, notwithstanding the fact that most of the country had no interest in it in terms of removing him. That's the extent to which they went crazy. And yet they had enormous success as they went insane. People like Matt Drudge and Rush Limbaugh, and then ultimately Fox News, found a massive audience and huge amounts of profit by funneling this oppositional energy, this fear of a leader from another party, by just turning him into this extremely scary, menacing demon who every day you could go and get your 2 minutes of hate from, Fox News and Rush Limbaugh. They became incredibly successful. And obviously the people at MSNBC who suffered through the Clinton years and then suffered through the Obama years with extremely low ratings saw that and realized very early on that Donald Trump was kind of the goose that is laying the golden egg for huge numbers of people by simply feeding them this steady diet of extremely hateful, conspiratorial garbage. And there's huge numbers of people all over Twitter and social media and in the mainstream media itself that have profited greatly by this. Their follower count has, gone from like 4,000 to 300,000. There's dozens and dozens of them for whom that's true. But nobody has profited more than Rachel Maddow because she has led the way with these Russia conspiracy theories from the start.
And there doesn't seem to be any shame in establishment media, meaning like there's nothing you can do that would discredit you at all. Well, we already know that. I have to tell people don't believe me when I tell them this, that MSNBC, if you're anti-war, they will fire you like they did to Phil Donahue, even though he had the #1 show on the network at the time, and they said they did it for low ratings. They got rid of Ashley Banfield, and so you cannot be against the war and have a job in establishment media. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Yes, it would depend what war you're talking about. I assume if Trump started a new war, people on MSNBC would be free to oppose it because it was Trump's war. It was certainly true of Obama. But in general, there are certain parameters that as long as you stay within them, you can never disqualify yourself. I don't know if you guys paid much attention, but there was this recent controversy over the last week because The Atlantic had hired Kevin Williamson, a writer from National Review, who is pro-life and anti-abortion and believes abortion is murder of innocent babies, and takes that position to its logical conclusion, which most anti-abortion writers and politicians don't have the courage to do, which is to say, well, look, if it's murdering innocent babies, we ought to treat it like all other murders and have the death penalty. I find that to be a repellent view, but that's the logical conclusion of opposing abortion and believing that it's murder. the reason why I found it so interesting wasn't because of Kevin Williams, because I don't care if he works or not. The reason I found it interesting was because the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic is somebody who has an infinitely more hideous record than Kevin Williamson. He literally worked as a colonel, as a prison guard in an Israeli gulag that, tortures and treats Palestinian detainees with every kind of conceivable war crime you can think of. He was probably the single leading propagandist that sold and deceived America on the fiction that Saddam Hussein was in an alliance with al-Qaeda. Throughout his career, he's been peddling all kinds of conspiracy theories. He tried to get the country ready for Israel attacking Iran. He's continually lied about the nature of Saddam's weapons program, even once he repented. I mean, he's somebody who has actually helped contribute to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. But because he's within this kind of pro-war orthodoxy, you can never have your career harmed by cheering on war. And, if you look at MSNBC, they have quote unquote liberals on there. Chris Hayes is probably the furthest one to the left. But they get every single segment MSNBC hosts get in their hand the ratings for the segment they just did, not the ratings for the show, but for each segment. And if they publish or broadcast a critic of the Trump-Russia theory or someone who's criticizing the Democratic Party from the left, the ratings dip because the audience has been trained to only want to consume things that validate and affirm their beliefs and never question or challenge them. And that's the incentive scheme they all face.
And so, I make fun of those people, right? Like, Chris Hayes is infinitely smarter than me and more accomplished, has read more books, yet I see right through him. And he really lacks a lot of integrity. And I'm not trying to bait you into criticizing Chris Hayes, but he doesn't have people like Thomas Frank on anymore. Like, he plays their game. He did show the empty podium for Trump instead of showing. He does all that horrible stuff. And so I just don't understand, as a comedian, I just couldn't sleep. As a comedian, I couldn't sleep with myself if I went on stage and spewed bullshit in a nightclub. Let alone, how do you think, it's got to be the $30,000 a day that makes it easier to put your head down and forget about all that shit you just did instead of actually serving the people. Because, they didn't talk about Oklahoma. They didn't talk about West Virginia. They're not talking about what's happening in Gaza. They smeared Bernie. They don't have on real progressives. And when they do, they only have them on the sandbag. Like they had Susan Sarandon. So I just don't get, I don't want to be part of that club, by the way. Anyway, there's a lot of people. Right. I just want to make fun of those people. So
let me just address that, because I think there's a lot of interesting things wrapped up into what you just said. And I guess I'll just preface it by saying that Chris is a personal friend of mine. He's somebody that I know pretty well. So I have a hard time, navigating my personal friendship with him, which breeds loyalty with, the fact that there are things that he does that I do think merit a lot of criticism. In the scheme of the American media, and I just want to leave Chris to the side for a second in this regard, I do think he does things that are better than other people, which is a really low bar.
Yes.
Like this week, he actually did a whole 3-minute commentary on Gaza that was extremely unabashedly critical of Israel. Putting all the blame on Israel, talking about the persecution of Gazans. He's put Bernie on a lot on his show and treats him pretty respectfully. That said,
cut this part out. Cut this out.
I'm sorry to infect your show with a tiny bit of Chris Hayes praise. But let me just say, this is what I find actually so interesting about Chris is in 2011, Chris wrote a book, the title of which was Twilight of the Elites. And the book was about elite culture and how it functions. And one of the principal points of his book, and I read the book and I wrote about it and I interviewed him about the book, and it's on Salon when I was at Salon, one of the principal purposes and corrupt anybody who enters it. So no matter how well-intentioned you are at the beginning, no matter how genuine you are in your convictions, the minute you become part of these elite institutions and they start rewarding you and you're around them all the time, subconsciously, inevitably you start identifying with them, becoming one of them, and essentially having everything that you once safeguarded as sacred about yourself compromised. And I asked him at the time, he didn't have a primetime show back then, but he did have the Saturday show. I think he was headed toward the primetime show. And I asked him, well, given this theory of inevitability, that everybody who enters elite culture is going to be corrupted, what have you done to safeguard against that happening to you now that you're making hundreds of thousands of dollars, by now certainly many millions of dollars a year, working for this massive corporation, going into work every day with people like Joy Reid and Chris Matthews and all the other horrible people who work in that building? Like, what are you doing to protect yourself? And he said, I don't really know. I haven't really thought about it much. So if you read his book, I think you
He wrote a goddamn book about it.
He wrote a fucking book about how if you go to work for places like MSNBC, you inevitably will become co-opted and corrupted by them. That's what Chris said. I'm not saying that. That was what he said in his book.
And so, you know, when I make criticisms of people like Chris Hayes, I used to always preface it by saying, "No, I'm sure Chris Hayes is a nice person. If I met him in a bar, we would have a lot of laughs together." And I'm still probably sure that would happen if I didn't know who he was. But so this towards your friend Chris Hayes, we could direct it in blanket of the media. So my whole point is these people, I'm sure, are nice people on a, you know, one-on-one basis, and they're smart and they've written. But how is it that they allow this to happen? How is it that when they see a guy who criticizes them accurately, like me, from the left, what do they do? What is the mental gymnastics do you think they do? And again, it's not. We don't have to make this personal about Chris. Let's make it about everybody at CNN and everybody at MSNBC.
I'd rather just spend the whole time bashing Chris personally, if that's okay. No, so let me just, this is a thing. I mean, you know, look, I thought about this a lot because over the last 5 years, doors that were previously closed to me have swung open. You know, I've made more money in the last 5 years than I ever did in my life. I grew up very poor. I struggled a lot when I got out of law school because I chose not to work at a big law firm, but to start my own firm. So I've navigated and struggled with these same kind of things, like, you know, what temptations get put in front of you that you have to be aware of to prevent your own corruption inadvertently. So I think that part of it is that, right? Like Chris grew up in a very modest home. And again, I'm not just using him as an example. I think I think one of his parents was a public school teacher, if I remember correctly, but he was definitely like lower middle class. He grew up in the Bronx, and in parts of Chicago, I think. And now he's, you know, has all the trappings of celebrity. He makes many millions of dollars a year. He has 2 small kids. He goes on, you know, Stephen Colbert and The Tonight Show. These are really powerful temptations for even the most noble of persons. And I don't exempt myself from that. Like, I'm speaking from experience here, where, you know, you get a taste of these things and then you start making compromises with yourself slowly and slowly and slowly. You make more and more and more of them to hold on to what it is that you have. I also think that it's important to think about how human beings function. So I'll just tell you this quick little story. So if you were to ask me, like, who is one of, like, aside from Fox News, who is the single most, like, deceitful, malicious, like, just journalistically unreliable, horrible person on television, I would instantly be able to give you my answer without any doubt, and that would be Joy Reid. Okay. One time, I think like 3 years ago, you're good with that? You're on board with that? So one time, like 3 years ago, I went to the Bill Maher show, and unbeknownst to me until like 2 days before, one of my fellow panelists was Joy. And we had a lot of really acrimonious exchanges, and I knew there was going to be tension, so we each had our own green room, and I like marched into her green room, and I introduced myself, and I shook her hand, and we sat down and talked, and she's a very pleasant, polite, like charming, intelligent, engaging person in real life when you're not like arguing about politics with her. And she's not like calling you, you know, someone who wants to desperately get fucked by Putin because you're an agent of the Kremlin. Like when she's not doing stuff like that, she's actually like a nice person. And so
Hitler was
I
nice
found
to
myself,
dogs. Hitler was nice to dogs.
Exactly. But I'm just saying it's easy to start when you go to work with somebody every day, when you are talking to them, when they're your colleagues, when it's easy to just start looking at all those people not as they really are, which is how you see them when you keep them at a distance, but they start getting distorted the more up close you get to them. So I think that's a big part of it, too. The more you're hanging out with politicians and celebrities and people who are just entrenched in the New York, D.C., L.A. political elite circles, the more you become someone who identifies with them. It's just an inevitable part of how human beings interact with each other.
Which is why in wartime, they don't let you fraternize with the enemy, right? Because you can't look at a picture of a guy's kids and then shoot him, right? So that's why I don't want to get close to those people. You know, Cenk Uygur still goes to those parties, right? He'll still go to the correspondence dinner and go to the parties afterwards. And I've always counseled him to not. My thing is, you don't want to be around those people. You don't want to get any of that on you. And you certainly don't want to become friends with them, because once you become friends with them, I know personally when I become friends with people, I don't want to criticize them anymore. It's harder to criticize someone who you know personally. And that's why you're not allowed to fraternize. And that's funny the way you put it, that the closer you get to them, the person they are gets distorted. So that there was this time, maybe like 2 years ago, I got invited to do this monk debate, which is like this very well-financed kind of like event that Rich Toronto puts on every year, and they invite 4 people to have a formal debate. And the debate was about surveillance, and my opponents were Alan Dershowitz and General Michael Hayden, who ran the CIA and the NSA during the War on Terror under George Bush. They told me, like, you have to get there early, and they have a cocktail party in honor of the 4 guests. And I knew that, like, we were all supposed to, like, you know, shake hands both before and after and be like, hey, really good spirited debate. I know we disagree, but I have huge respect for you. And there's, like, Alan fucking Dershowitz, like, the person who just cheered. The more you, like, slaughter Palestinians, like, the harder his erections get. And you have, like, Michael Hayden, who literally oversaw the CIA and the NSA during the War on Terror. I was not going to, go through that process of pretending to be civil with them or have respect for them. So I gave an interview the day before to the main Toronto paper, and I talked about this dilemma, how they wanted me to have cocktail parties with them. And I said, it's really hard because these are 2 of the most, I think I said, like, sociopathic monsters on the planet. And the headline of the paper that morning when I woke up and saw it in my hotel room was, Greenwald, I'm debating 2 of the most sociopathic monsters on the planet. So it prevented, obviously, the 4 of us from, like, having this communion which I purposely sabotaged for exactly that reason. Like, if I had ended up talking to Alan Dershowitz about his grandkids or Michael Hayden about, like, where he's traveled, I probably would have ended up hating them less. And I wanted to make sure that didn't happen. That's a danger you do have to be cautious about. And I've actually had that happen to me, where right-wingers will engage me, and then people who are their fans will tell them, quit humanizing Jimmy Dore. So I know exactly what that means. Please make sure you're subscribed. It only takes a second. Make sure you're subscribed and click that bell so they give you a notice whenever we drop a video. And if you can become a patron, we give you hours of bonus material every week. Our next live show is June 30th in Portland, Oregon. And we do a super solid chat every Saturday. That's our live stream. You can ask us questions and we answer back. That's Saturdays at 2 p.m. Pacific. Plus, we're on Steam It. We're steaming it right now.